For this week's Shipwreck video, we return to the Kure wrecks, this time moving from the single wreck of Haruna to the twin wrecks of Ise and Hyuga, Japan's famous battle carriers. These were interesting ships, although arguably a bit of a wasted effort. I've covered Hyuga in a dedicated video, and I'll link that in the description. For this video, we'll be focusing much more on the wrecks of the ships. This will be a double feature because Ise and Hyuga's wrecks are very similar. Both were sunk in shallow water at Kure, and both show similar damage patterns. It felt fitting to cover them together. After all, these ships lived together, fought together, and were ultimately sunk together. Much like with Haruna, the Ise sisters were stuck in Japan. After being used as giant transports at the start of 1945, the fuel supply became critical. So by March of 1945, they were back in Japan with most of the remaining fleet, and they would never leave again. American air raids on Kure would begin that month. On March 19th, Task Force 58 hit the area. This initial raid did minimal damage to the battleships. Hyuga was hit by 3 bombs. Ise, meanwhile, suffered 2 hits. In both cases, the damage was minor, so both of the battle carriers were towed to new positions, where they would function as stationary anti-aircraft batteries. They would remain in that position when the fast carriers returned in July. Those attacks began on July 24th. This attack would cause varying degrees of damage. Ships like Katsuragi and Haruna escaped major damage. On the other hand, Ise, Hyuga, and Amagi would all be severely damaged. Ise suffered 5 hits, along with many near misses. These included a hit to the flight deck and the number 3 turret. The most notable one, however, was a direct hit on the bridge. Ise's captain was lost during this, along with many others in that position. In the end, 50 of the crew were lost in this attack. Nonetheless, while down by the bow, the ship remained afloat. Hyuga would not be so lucky. She would be attacked with up to 200 bombs, depending on the source, with 10 direct hits and 30 near misses. Those hits opened seams and blasted her structure, causing severe flooding. And just like Ise, the ship suffered damage to the bridge. Except Hyuga had 3 bomb hits near the bridge. This led to the loss of her captain as well. Hyuga would settle on the bottom by July 26th, with over 200 men lost and a further 600 wounded. Both ships would be attacked again on July 28th. This was the same attack that sunk Haruna, and while Hyuga was already on the bottom, she was bombed again. This would prompt the Japanese to abandon the Hulk, even though she was in shallow water. As for Ise, she had been pumped out from her damage on the 24th. There had even been some ideas of towing her to dry dock for repair work. Those plans were put to bed by the attack on July 28th. Sources will differ on exactly how many hits she suffered, ranging from 11 according to combined fleet, all the way up to 15 direct hits and many more near misses. These included 1,000-pound bombs, which caused severe damage to the ship. Ise would finally sink after all this damage, bringing an end to the Ise class in service. As with Haruna, this was July 1945, only a couple weeks before Japan surrendered. Nowhere near enough time to repair the ships, even if that were possible. Both Hyuga and Ise were left in place, subject to curious onlookers, for a couple years. It would take about a year for scrapping to begin, with this process starting in mid-1946. Most sources will have it concluding by the end of 1947. Although at least one picture of Ise with her turrets removed is cited as January 1948. Make of that what you will. That said, before the scrapping finished, quite a few pictures were taken of these wrecks. along with video, which I'll also link in the description. Let's look at those now, beginning with Hyuga and then moving to Ise. We'll begin with probably the most famous picture of Hyuga's wreck, which is this photo from an aircraft off USS Siboney. It serves to demonstrate how shallow the wreck really was. Looking at this, you can see why American aircraft would have attacked the ship, even after she was sunk. Most of the hull, including the forward turrets, remain above water. In any case, let's look at the next shot, which is from the water, looking at the opposite end of the ship. Here we have the distinctive flight deck, which is almost entirely at the waterline, a mix of settling into the bottom and high tide. However, most of the damage is still hidden from this angle. You can see some debris here, but this side of the ship has relatively little damage. This picture from a bit further ahead shows the funnel and bridge. This doesn't show much visible damage, but there are interesting notes. For example, the camouflage visible on the bow turrets. A splotchy pattern, quite unlike the tiger stripes on Haruna. And moving a bit back, you can also see the pagoda. Not quite to the ludicrous size of the Fuso model, but still quite notable. And even more apparent with this picture. It shows how the pagoda towers over the ship. But perhaps even more importantly, it also shows how damaged the structure is. The other angles didn't do a good job of showing this, but you can see the decks drooping down here. That is likely where some of the bomb damage mentioned earlier occurred. And here we get a better look at that from quite close up. The bomb damage is apparent, along with shrapnel holes. You can also see clear fire damage in the same area. And the tower in general is a mess of broken metal, especially here. Yet, by some miracle, there's a 25mm gun mount still in place here. You can also see a radar fitted to the rangefinder at the top. Now, moving on from there, we only have one more shot from the water, in this case showing most of the ship from the bow. However, there's not a lot to note. It's just a nice look from the bow. With that concluding the waterline pictures, it's time to return to the air. Starting with this one, looking at the wreck from the side. This goes further to show how deep the hulk was when at high tide. The number 4 turret here is almost completely submerged, while the flight deck and bow are both barely above water. That aside, however, there's not much here we haven't seen already. For that, we have the last couple pictures, taken from directly above the ship, showing the damage in stark detail. The first thing to jump out here is going to be the flight deck. The elevator has fallen into the hangar, of course, but you can also see where the deck ends, moving towards the aft superstructure. Hyuga's stern has been burnt and blasted out here. It wasn't apparent from the water, but looking from above, it's very clear. This is likely where most of the flooding took place. Moving a bit ahead from there, you can also see the submerged number 4 turret, which is actually pointing out to the side where it was left before the crew lost power. Unfortunately, any more detail, either on the flight deck or turret, is underwater. On the other hand, when you move to the bow, you can see empty holes along the superstructure. That's where the secondary battery was mounted. As for the next picture, it shows a much earlier look at the wreck. Oil is clearly leaking, as you can see from the oil slick. And the damage on the flight deck isn't quite as severe. You can see distinct bomb hits here and here. This picture was likely taken between the July 24th and July 28th attacks, before fires and further bomb hits completely wrecked the stern. The last picture of the wreck, meanwhile, shows Hyuga after some scrapping had been done. It's too high up to make out much detail, but it appears most of the superstructure is gone, putting this at a similar stage as the last picture of Haruna. Without much more detail to note, however, let's move on to Ise. This wreck is easy to distinguish from her sister for a couple reasons. First and foremost, the fact she's much closer to shore, as you can see here from an aircraft photo. This also shows the other detail to tell the ships apart. Hyuga's guns were all level. Ise's super-firing turrets are both pointing skyward. The bow turret here is elevated quite high. The number 3 turret here isn't quite as elevated. However, it is still visible. So if you see a picture of the wreck labeled as Hyuga, it's easy to correct based on the turrets, and vice versa. In any event, this particular picture also shows damage to the stern. Part of the flight deck has collapsed here, with wreckage visible in the water. It's severe damage, but not quite as bad as Hyuga. From higher up in this picture, that wreckage is more visible in the water, along with how close Ise was to the pier here. Close enough that there was something stretched out from shore to the ship on her stern. You can also see the number 4 turret still pointing directly astern. Past that, with the next picture, we get on the water and look at the bow. This shows just how high the barrels, at different angles, are elevated on the super-firing turret. It also shows how much of the ship is submerged behind the funnel. Actually, Ise has a pretty severe list. If the water were deeper, she might well have capsized. As it is, the ship came to rest at an angle. The other notable thing about this picture is the pagoda. More of the camouflage paint is still intact, and there's far less damage here. This is another way to tell the sisters apart, considering how much more damage Hyuga took to her bridge structure. This more intact nature also allows you to pick out 25mm gun mounts, which I'll put arrows towards. The Japanese were even stuffing these things on the pagoda mast by the end of the war. For its part, the next image moves from directly forward, mostly useful for showing how low in the water the wreck is, and in general, being a nice bow angle. It also demonstrates the angle of the number 2 turret's barrels, which you can see far better here, from much closer in, looking at the pagoda and turrets. This is also the last shot from the waterline. From here, we move to the deck. Unlike Hyuga, Ise has quite a few pictures from aboard the Hulk, such as this one looking up at the pagoda. That paint is quite clear in all its blotchy glory, as is the general shape of the pagoda, which is easier to make out from the front. You can see each individual deck from the bridge on up. Considering what happened to Hyuga, Fuso, and Yamashiro, this is the best look at a pagoda mast that you'll likely find, at least of the original style. Nagato had a more modern approach that isn't quite as haphazard. This picture also shows equipment scattered on the deck, from piping to rope, something we can see better in the next image, along with the anchor chain. Frankly, from this angle, Ise doesn't look that bad, aside from the obvious listing. It's a good example of how an image's angle can disguise damage on a shipwreck. Personally, though, I find the next 2 pictures more interesting. These were taken from inside the pagoda, apparently on October 8th, 1945. Here we're looking down on the bow, which shows how intact the bow deck is, along with a landing craft moored alongside. The most notable part here, however, is the number 1 turret. There's a bomb hit right at the front. This penetrated the turret roof, and you can see the hole it left. It didn't cause any major damage beyond that, or at least nothing visible from above. In the next picture, we look to the stern, which has 2 things of note. First, the burnt out and damaged funnel, with some broken equipment here. And then further aft, the battered flight deck. The worst of the damage isn't visible here, but you can see debris scattered on the deck, which you can see even better here from above. This shows the massive hole in the flight deck, as well as a smaller bomb hole here and the fallen elevator behind it. Certainly rough, but still not as bad as Hyuga. On the topic of Hyuga, you can also see similar openings in the superstructure, where the secondary guns were removed. However, this does bring us to the end of the video, with a return to a deck shot inside the ruined hangar. My guess would be Ise, judging from the list and the other photos. However, there's not much to identify either way, just a hilly island in the background. Although it does make a fitting ending, a look inside the most distinctive feature of these ships after their modification. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.